2, 1.
Okay, well,
Wait, don't start.
ah,
Still not live.
okay.
Okay. All right, we are now. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming
Okay,
to.
well,
Wait, don't start.
ah,
Still not live. Okay. Thank you for coming to our CEDA lecture series. You just experienced Jackie's inability to understand technology for a second. So I have Matt Liu, the Director of Forensics at the University of Wyoming with us today to talk about cross-examination. So without further ado, I'll kick it over to Matt.
all right. Thanks for joining, everybody. I hope this will end up being pretty helpful for you. And if you think the lecture is good and you want to get more into it, I have my written lecture on cross-ex on Wyoming Debate's website, so you can always go there for a backup. I like to be pretty organized when I lecture, so this lecture is divided up into 3 sections. Types of questions that you can ask in cross-ex, big meta tips about how to do cross-ex well, and focused narrow tips about how to get particular parts of cross-ex right. So if you like to take organized notes, then we're starting what is the first section, which is going to be a little bit of an introduction and mostly the types of questions that there are in cross-ex. Now, the title of this lecture is that cross-ex is speech time. Cross-ex is speech time. And I think that this captures a lot of the gist of what I'm going to try and point toward in this lecture, which is that you should not think of cross-examination as something that's fundamentally different from a constructive or a rebuttal. Because just like every other speech, it's something that you need to practice and prepare for. It's something that you need to have questions written down for. It's something that most judges will flow, and it's an opportunity for you to persuade the judge. So younger debaters will often fall into the trap of treating cross-ex like bonus prep time or just buying time for your partner to have extra time to prep their speech. And I think that is a mistake, that if you don't treat cross-ex like one of the best opportunities to persuade the judge in a debate, then you're going to fall significantly far behind your opponent. It is also a critically important time to form impressions, because it is the point of the debate that blocks are least useful. So if you want to demonstrate that you are smarter than your opponent's blocks, and this can be something that's terribly important for small schools where your opponents might have 9 coaches or tons of debaters just churning out block after block for them. Cross-ex is the moment where you're going to be able to demonstrate your intellect can tear apart their blocks. And I've never been a person who thought that rep is a thing that matters in debate. I know that it's difficult to avoid sometimes thinking that you lost because your opponent had a better rep than you. I've largely thought that's not really a thing that determines many debate rounds, because I think that cred is a thing. And the difference is that credibility is something that's determined in the round, not before it. This idea of rep is like, if you're already good, judges will vote for you. I think that's largely bunk. It assumes I know who you are. But credibility, all of the little things we do to signal that we know what a debate should look like, that we've prepared for this intensely, that's all determined end round and does create a reputation-like signal to the judge, but it's one that you have complete control over. And I think cross-ex is one of the most important places to establish that. So I think there are 3 types of cross-ex questions. And the first is information seeking. Before we can talk about how to do cross-ex well, we got to know what each type of question is trying to do. Information seeking questions are trying to figure out what your opponent has said or what their argument is. And I think that you should avoid these as much as possible. So let's start with the assumption that you don't understand your opponent's argument, that you literally just have no idea what it says. Maybe it's a literature base that you're not familiar with, the critique, or even a particular area of policy that you just don't know what it is. It's totally novel to you. I understand the impulse to try and use cross-ex to figure it out. And in a way, you should, but not by asking them what the argument is. And the reason is, your opponent does not have your best interest in mind. They are not trying to help you. They are trying to win the debate. Your question to them of what does this say is a springboard to give the judge an advanced understanding of the position while you're still looking for a basic one. Instead of asking, I think that you should start to make attacks against the position, start to try and poke holes in it. And I understand that if you don't know what the argument is, your arguments as to why it's wrong will initially not be perfect. But by forcing your opponent to explain why your questions are off, they will actually have to do the basic explanation rather than the advanced explanation. They are then forced to give you what you actually want, which is the basic rundown of the position, so they can correct why your question's wrong. And as a side benefit, to whatever degree that your attack is effective, you've started to punch holes in your opponent's argument. And that's obviously way more useful to you than just giving them a chance to explain, which kind of like scores you 0 points because they get all the time to talk about their argument. But to whatever extent you are able to effectively punch holes in it, seeking understanding through attack benefits you in addition to giving them the necessary talk time. A second type of information-seeking question is less about like, what does this say, and more about what did you read? And so with younger debaters, or distressingly even older debaters, as we get worse and worse at flowing, I hear questions like, did you read the Joe and 14 evidence? Or what's the last piece of evidence you read? Or where did you mark that? To the folks that are asking these questions, I have one piece of advice: flow, and trust your flow. Because when you ask, did you read this card? I have started my timer, and I will usually, even on a Zoom debate, I will demonstrate this by holding the timer up, because you have asked a question. Now, I will agree, it's not a question that has a lot of utility, doesn't help you win the debate, but you have asked a question. You are using cross-examination. So some timer's got to be running. Maybe it's your prep time, but it's probably going to be that cross-ex time, which means your speech time is depleting. Your time to make arguments is depleting. So flow and trust your flow. And if Jackie would like to bring me back to talk about flowing, I will happily do that, because that is, of course, a basic prereq skill to get all the rest of this right. But you've got to flow, and you've got to trust your flow. And the same thing is true of theory check questions. Way too often, judges hear questions like, what were the reasons to reject the team? Which permutations did you make? Et cetera, et cetera. Flow and trust your flow. There's only one theory check question that you should ask, because there's no other way to get the answer, and that is, under what conditions can you kick the counterplan? That should be the very first question you ask in the cross-ex of every 1NC, so you never forget to ask. And you should get it out of the way immediately so you can move on to the bulk of what your cross-ex should be. That's the first type of question, information seeking. The second type of question is the trap, aka the reversed pit of doom. In a trap question, you're trying to motivate the speaker to give the answer you want by misleading them into thinking it's the answer you don't want. In other words, it's reverse psychology. And once you've been in debate for just a little while, there's an element of human nature that becomes very apparent, which is that debaters are hardwired to disagree with their opponents. It is just automatic that your opponent asks you a question in cross-ex, you're going to say they're wrong, or you're going to be distrustful of them. And so you've probably heard the line, the 1AC doesn't take a stance on that in cross-ex. And sometimes this is asked in response to reasonable things. But I honestly think that, especially with young debaters, we're so distrustful and hardwired to disagree that we'll say things like that to totally ridiculous questions. Like if your opponent asks, hey, is the sky blue? I would not be entirely surprised if a young debater responded, the 1AC does not take a stance on the color of the sky. Now, you can, of course, avoid ridiculous hedging like this by just knowing your arguments inside and outside. Because if you know your stuff, you won't be scared to defend it. You'll be confident to defend the claims that you have made. But we can take advantage of these psychological impulses. And I'm going to give the example of when you're planning on stealing someone's impact. Let's say you're going to straight turn a DA. And so, again, I could do a lecture on how to straight turn things and what's offense and defense. But I'm going to assume for the most part that folks are going to get the idea that if I say you want to straight turn a disadvantage, that you're taking the impact for yourself. So if a disadvantage is read with a climate change impact, then your goal in link turning this DA would be to say that the affirmative solves climate change better than the negative disadvantage story does, either because the mechanism of the plan solves it or you're link turning the DA. Either way, although the negative introduced the climate change impact to the DA, you're going to take that and make it yours. In cross-examination, you can bolster this strategy by tricking the negative into talking about how great their impact is. So again, with a reverse pit of doom or a trap, you want your opponent to believe you're asking the opposite question that you are. So you wouldn't say, hey, I like your climate change impact, I'm going to steal it. It's great, right? You would do the opposite. You would go on the attack. So you would ask a question like, didn't the IPCC just say it's going to be 100 years before we see anything close to existential impacts to climate change? And your opponent's going to say, no, that's entirely wrong. The latest data says it's going to be less than 20 years before runaway warming and positive feedback loops make desertification and a hothouse Earth an impossible place for humans to live. That's time frame, right? By attacking the time frame of the impact, your opponent just gave you great time frame. You can do this for magnitude. You can do this for probability. You can do this for turns the case argument. So maybe there are evidence hints at how climate change causes war. You can get them to expand on that. And now your stolen climate change impact turns war impacts. And one of the most effective strategies here is to make sure that there's no possible alt causes. So you can say things like, if you're link turning a politics DA, I'll throw back to the Green New Deal or infrastructure DAs. You could ask a question like, can this infrastructure bill, this like one-shot infrastructure spending bill, is that really sufficient to solve climate change, which is a global problem that other countries contribute to, and there's many sources of emissions? And then they will explain a big solvency argument for their internal link. And they will explain why the internal link is sufficient to solve climate change. And what that provides is insulation against DA turns the stolen impact later on. Like if later on they try to say, well, our other impact turns climate change, you can be like, nope, in cross-ex, you said the infrastructure bill was sufficient by itself to solve climate change. That means no other political situation that you talk about on your other arguments can turn climate change because infrastructure always solves, which was a strategic concession we made from cross-ex. Okay, traps are great. You make your opponent do your work for you. And there's no arg more true in a debate than an argument that was initially advanced by your opponent. So traps are great, but they are difficult to set. They require lots of planning. I think they probably require cooperative strategy pre-round, working with your partner or your coaches or your teammates to plan traps, because you have to have a good working knowledge of human psychology, how your opponent is going to treat a question. So they're probably not going to dominate your cross-ex. They're awesome, they're cool, they're fun, but they're not going to be the vast majority of your cross-ex. And that brings us to the third type of question, argumentative questions. These are questions that just directly refute the thing your opponent says. Your opponent has a hedge advantage, and you're going to ask questions that are like, you don't solve hedge because of X, Y, Z. You're going to poke holes in the affirmative case. Argumentative questions. And this brings us to part 2 of the lecture. 5 big tips, the meta strategies for doing a great cross-ex. First, argue, don't ask. Argue, don't ask. I went through the types of questions so we could get to the winning kind, argumentative questions. These should make up the vast majority of your cross-examination. They're high utility because they get airtime for your arguments. It lets you make your args hang in the judge's mind, and it previews the things that you're going to say in the next speech, which can save you time later. And let me clarify what I mean by this. I don't mean the clunky expression when you say something like, that was in cross-ex, or we pwned them on this in cross-ex. I don't think those lines sound good, and I don't think there's a large group of judges that appreciate that. I'm talking about an implicit effect that's automatic, because if you have a great cross-ex on an issue that was complicated, but decisively breaks in your favor after the cross-examination, then on that issue, you've cleared up confusion for the judge. You have put them on your side. So it's not that in the next speech you have to say, I already explained this in cross-ex. It's that you taught the judge the thing you wanted them to know. They know it now. I think that to understand this, you have to get that judges aren't machines, that we don't know everything, and that we're imperfect, and that so much more of a debate than you think it is about teaching and persuasion, not entering arguments into the record. Debate is not just, handing a judge a card doc and letting them read it. It is teaching the judge a complex argument that you have hopefully worked on and prepared in between a tournament. And if you use cross-ex to foreshadow those arguments, to explain them, to take challenging moments and unpack them for the judge, your 1R, your next speech, it becomes so much easier. You've done the hard part. You taught the judge the thing. So this last point on this, it also makes cross-ex really easy to prepare. I will often have debaters that give, for example, a phenomenal 1R, but they have no idea how to cross-ex the 2AC. But the easy way to fix this is that they are the same speech. If your cross-ex of the 2AC is just 3 minutes of tearing apart the 2AC to the arg that you're going to go for in the 1R, you have all the arguments. If you were going to give a brilliant 1R, you already know the arguments you want to make. You already know why every 2AC answer is wrong. And so making this cross-ex strategic is just about lining it up with the great 1R you are already going to give, because it's your job to preview those arguments. Some of this can, of course, include reading the ununderlined size 4 portions of your opponent's evidence, or noticing that the article title goes the wrong way and opening up the article and pointing out that there's tons of alt causes the author concludes in the other direction. But these questions should be argumentative, and that means not open-ended. I know we've got folks from college and high school here, so I'm going to give a college topic example, and then I'm going to give a high school policy example. So the college topic involves endowing non-human entities with legal status, and that is commonly met with a DA called spillover, that says that if you give a mouse a cookie, then another non-human entity will also get a cookie, or in this case, legal status in the American court system. And so a common answer to the spillover DA is to argue that there's already some form of legal personhood or legal status for non-human entities now. And so someone could ask the question, why doesn't the status quo trigger your spillover DA? And to be clear, this is the bad question, because it's open-ended. You don't advance an argument. You're just asking. And your opponent can say whatever they want to say. They can start to talk about how there's a firewall between human and non-human ability to have legal standing in courts. They can say whatever they want to say. But let's rephrase this question. It's not open-ended anymore. It's argumentative. And so your new question is, given that legal status has been given to tons of non-human entities, like local ordinances that established rights for the Tamaqua Borough, which is an ecosystem in Pennsylvania, or waterways in Florida, that Saudi Arabia gave Sophia and artificial intelligence rights, that Wyoming, the state where I'm from, has endowed blockchain or decentralized organizations with legal standing. Aren't all of these reasons why your DA is terminally non-unique? The difference between those two questions is that in the latter version, the affirmative is advancing arguments about why the DA is wrong. They are arguing, they are not asking. And I like to conceive of cross-ex like a tally chart, just line, line, af, neg, are we getting tallies in the columns? And if you ask, why doesn't the status quo trigger the DA? Zero tallies. There's 0 arguments. Now, quality of question and answer and warrants certainly matters, but you can't get on the board without even one argument, one warrant that helps you win the debate. So the first question, 0 tallies. The second question, I think 4. I think I made 4 args, like 2 were ordinances though, so maybe it was really 3. Either way, you're on the board. And your opponent has to try and keep up and refute each of those examples. And suddenly it's a lot more work for your opponent too. So I was going to do a high school topic example too. So we've got cooperation with NATO. This is going to lead to a bunch of debates about Russia. And so someone might want to ask the question, isn't Russia a revisionist? Aren't they a revisionist power? Open-ended, no argument. Let's rephrase. It seems obvious to me that Russia's revisionist. They invaded Georgia, they invaded the Ukraine, and you're probably going to say that it was caused by NATO expansion, but that doesn't explain the brutality within which they have waged these wars, bombing maternity wards, nor does it explain the specific military strategies like the development of tactical nuclear weapons or the subs in the Baltic Sea that can only be used for expansive offensive purposes. Obviously, second version of the question has a lot more tallies, gets you on the board. It has more warrants for why Russia is revisionist. Now, you don't need to understand either of these topics or what revisionism is or what legal status in a US court implies to get the basic idea that the more warrants your question has, the more arguments your question makes, the more tallies you put on the board. And again, quality matters. I'm not only going for quantity here. That's not what I mean by the tally chart. It's supposed to get the basic idea that you have to make an argument to get on the board. The last benefit to this is that it constrains your opponent's answer. Just like politicians, every debater wants to use a question as a springboard to talk about what they want to talk about. If you ask me a question about the solvency of my affirmative, what I want to do in cross-ex is preview my 2AC we solve block. We solve for 3 reasons. 1, 2, 3. That's what I want to do. And if you're just like, how does the AF solve this? I get to go, well, we solve for 3 reasons. 1, 2, 3. But if you have a very specific question about a particular alt cause, I could read that block. And when I say read that block, it's like I'm being a little bit metaphorical here. I could make the arguments I want to make, but I think they're going to be a lot less responsive, and I'm not really going to answer the question. So I'm probably constrained in these scenarios where you've asked a specific question to respond to what you've said instead of using my stump speech that I want to give. So argumentative questions, in addition to helping you more, have the side benefit of hurting your opponent or hurting their ability to make the arguments they want. Okay, we're still in section 2, 5 big tips. We are now moving from big tip 1, argue, don't ask, to big tip 2. Don't beat a dead horse. Don't beat a dead horse. This tip is about pacing, because I generally find that after I teach debaters argue, don't ask, they'll do it, but they're just going to argue that first question and they're going to get stuck there, and that is all they're going to talk about. But don't beat a dead horse. Be more willing to move on to make more arguments. And the reason why you want to do this is because cross-ex is not about your opponents, it is about the judge. So you might get stuck on a question either because your opponent has failed to give you an answer you think makes any sense, or they just refuse to agree with you. Here's the thing though, that's their job. It's literally their job to refuse to agree with you. You can't convince your opponents of anything because they don't want to admit weakness. They will almost never just be like, yeah, you're right about that question. In fact, this DA is so bad, I think that Jackie should just like tear up her flow. There's no chance that we will go for this disadvantage. You have utterly humiliated and embarrassed me, and I now forfeit. That's not going to happen. They're going to continue to argue with you. So you need to reframe that the point of cross-ex is to persuade the judge. And the question you should ask is, how long does it take the judge to understand the argument you're making with the question? I'm going to ask it again. This is where your mindset should be. How long does it take the judge to understand the argument that you're making with a question? And the answer is that we usually understand it, especially if you're doing your job right, before you've finished asking the question. I honestly don't think this is that terribly surprising. Like just imagine some of my examples from before. I was like, isn't Russia revisionist? They invaded Ukraine and Georgia. And then I talked for like 30 more seconds. You got the arg I was making when I said Georgia and Ukraine, right? Russia invaded countries. That's pretty much all I'm saying there. And so Russia equals aggressive. They want to take land, restore the USSR. Your judges are going to get that really quick, again, before you've finished asking the question. And knowing that, you need to understand that everything after the judge understands the point of the question is diminishing marginal utility. It's diminishing marginal returns. Once the judge understands the argument you're trying to make, your question can no longer help you win the debate. It's not a bad thing. The question did its job. You made an argument, the judge understood it. That's what's supposed to happen. But if you ask the same question again, a second time, it provides no new information for the judge. It does not help you win the debate in any way because the judge already understood the information garnered from the first time you asked the question. And honestly, it can easily hurt you to ask a question a second time. So let's say you ask your question, your opponent gives an answer that you think is bad, and instead of pocketing the win and moving on, your response is to double down and explain to them why their answer is bad. You don't advance in the debate because the judge doesn't get any new information. But what if your opponent does? What if your opponent uses that extra 10 seconds to figure out a good answer to your question? You had a W. Your opponent flubbed the question. But because you doubled down on that, you gave them the time to turn their L into a win. And now you're the one that's taking a loss on that cross-ex question, because you gave your opponent time to figure out how to save themselves. Your goal should be to ask 9 unique argumentative questions in a cross-ex. 9 unique argumentative questions. And let me be clear, I am all about setting this goal much more than I am about completing it. If you don't ask 9 questions, I'm not going to say like your cross-ex strategy failed, like you did cross-ex wrong. Because if you set a goal to ask 9 questions, and more importantly, had 9 questions prepared to ask, you will drive yourself to keep the pace up because you'll have 9 args you want to make, and you won't let yourself get tied down to any one particular argument. And I want you to think about the other speeches, right? My thesis, cross-ex is a speech, constructives and rebuttals. How many arguments per minute do you think you make in a constructive or a rebuttal? Put yourself in 2AR mode, 60 seconds. It's a lot of time. I think you make a lot of arguments in 60 seconds. And I'll even give you that cross-ex is really like every second is like half a second. So a minute is 30 seconds because you're theoretically splitting it with your opponent. But if you make 10 arguments in a minute in a rebuttal, which is like, you know, I think you probably make more than 10 arguments in a minute in a rebuttal, then we would expect you to make at least 5 arguments in a minute in cross-ex. But most of the cross-exes that I see really only contain 1 argument per minute, and that can be improved upon. Your pace can be advanced. I have a little bit more of pacing stuff to talk about because we need to answer the question, what happens when your opponent has a smart answer? Matt, you said pacing matters. Should you just ignore it and move on? And the answer is no, because you don't want to hand your opponent a win on any particular cross-ex question. So if your opponent has a smart, well-developed response to your question, it does change things a little bit. And the formula that I want to give you for dealing with this is I'm going to call either no and or transition to win. And I'll unpack both of those. You don't want to look like you're losing on an issue in cross-ex, but you don't want to circle back to be saying the same things. And the difference is whether you're responding to their argument at the next level, if you're making a new argument to respond to that. Like think about framework debates. We use this phrase like 3rd and 4th level debates all the time. Your arg was the 1st level. Their response is the 2nd level. If what you're going to say is just to repeat yourself to a good answer to your question, you did not get to what framework says we should be at, which is the 3rd level response. Because this is where you want to be, but then you want to stop it. You don't want to give your opponent a chance for a 4th level response. And so that's where we're going to get no and. And I'm ripping this off of like the improv idea of yes and, where in an improv, in like an improv comedy situation, you're supposed to respond to like any given situation by agreeing and then moving on. We are in the opposite situation here, no and. You provide a 3rd level response that is a direct answer to the question to the response that they have given. and then you move on. You transition to win. You pocket a W and then move on. So you want to give a very concise answer here that slides into your next question so quickly that your opponent can't keep the debate dwelling on this issue. You get to keep the pace up, but you don't end on a loss. Now, the trick here, and what I've come to realize after giving this lecture many times, is that you need to have a well-warranted response. So it sounds, when I say no and, I don't mean literally say no and. You have to have a reason, an argument, a warrant, a good argument. Because if you're just like, I disagree with that, that's silly, you're being absurd, and then you move on, well, it's an ad hominem attack. You haven't made an argument, you've just stated that you disagree. What you need to do is listen to what they've said, so you have the ability to process it, refute it, and then move on to your next question. And this back and forth can get into some complicated issues of debaters either letting their opponents talk for too long or interrupting each other too much. And let me be clear, my thesis here is more questions is good for you, but that is not an excuse to constantly interrupt or talk over your opponents in cross-ex. Not only does that not sound good, probably not great for your speaker points, the message you're sending is that your arguments can't hold up to the scrutiny of an actual response by your opponents. Because if you're unwilling to let your opponent respond to your questions in cross-ex, like, why should I think they're good questions? If you can't trust that they can stand up to giving your opponent more than 2.5 seconds to respond to them, then I probably think you're just not asking good questions because you won't even let your opponent talk about them. So we don't want to interrupt too much, and we don't want to let our opponent talk forever, right? You have to have a balanced amount of minutes in the cross-examination. Ideally, I mean, you kind of do want more of the minutes because whoever's talking more is going to have the opportunity to make more arguments. And this might sound complicated, and it might sound like I'm about to say it's more art than science, which is probably not very helpful, but it's not. It's not actually that complicated because here's the deal. You get one real chance to answer a question. If you fail, your opponent does not owe you a second chance. They can move on. But you have to give your opponent the real chance to answer the question, including the real amount of time that would be necessary. If they are flabbergasted and saying nonsense and not responding to the question, I think you should move on. They had their one real chance. They don't get to just say a bunch of filler words to think of time to answer the question and then go. It's all about who the judge is going to be sympathetic to. If you interrupt after 1.5 seconds, you do not have my sympathy. That's a bad place for you to be in. If your opponent fails to answer the question, I'm not sympathetic to them. You can move on. Third, have a written list of questions. Have a written list of questions. Opening of the lecture, cross-ex is a speech, prep for it like a speech. Otherwise, you're going to end up with way too many needed Twix moments where you're shuffling sheets of flow paper or scrolling through a doc, and there's going to be lots of uhs and ums as you think about, maybe you had an idea of the questions you wanted to ask, but you got distracted by how annoying your opponent's answer was, and now you've forgotten everything. Have a written list of questions in detail. You wouldn't write only the vaguest of things on your flow to prepare for an argument and a rebuttal. And similarly, you should be more detailed in the way you write your questions down in cross-ex, including thinking about the second, third, and fourth level. Like, there are a lot of times when I ask a question and I have a pretty good idea of what my opponent's answer is going to be. And so I'll usually draw like kind of one of these, like down and to the right, where I can put, if they say this thing, here's how I would respond to that. So I literally have my second level of cross-ex prepared and written down if I'm pretty confident that that's the direction that the cross-examination is going to go. And so I think the logical question here is that I'm just telling you to do a whole bunch of stuff. And how on earth are you supposed to have time to do any of this? How on earth are you supposed to have time to write 9 questions in detail and have some of them have a second level of explanation? The answer is that you only have two jobs when you have a cross-ex coming up. Two jobs. One, flow, and two, prepare for your cross-ex. If you have a cross-ex, it's your next speech. You don't have a constructive or a rebuttal as your next speech. You have a cross-examination for your next speech. So focus on the immediate task, which is that cross-ex, which requires only two things: flowing and getting ready for that cross-examination. There will occasionally be exceptions where your partner asks you for help in a pinch, but we're going to try and avoid that because we're going to say, stay task focused on the thing that matters for us, which is our cross-examination. And maybe you're thinking, some of you are definitely thinking, that sounds nice in theory, Matt, but I have a real speech coming up after this, and I'm going to prep that and wing cross-ex. And I would disagree with you vigorously about what a real speech is. But more important, if you are prepping cross-ex, you are prepping the speech that you have after that. The cross-ex of the 2AC needs to tear apart the 2AC to the position that you're going to take in the 1NR. If you're prepping the cross-ex of the 2AC right, you are already prepping the 1NR, and you are prepping the hardest parts because you are prepping the parts that are going to be more challenging to talk about and unpack. Fourth, prioritize. You shouldn't just ask cross-ex questions in the order that you thought of them or the order that you wrote them down. You need a mission, a plan, priorities. And that involves a willingness to radically reorganize your questions. So, when I was debating and I was, generating cross-ex questions, I'd always number them. So like the question I thought was most important on my sheet of paper that was solely about cross-ex questions, I would write down 1 next to the question that I thought was most important. But I came up with that question 2 minutes into a much longer speech. And if that's true, I might come up with better questions later on. So you need to be willing to scratch out that number 1 and make it a number 2 because something else is the new number 1, and so on and so forth, so that you're always prioritizing what the most important question in this cross-ex is. I'm going to stick to this analysis of the cross-ex of the 2AC. If you're cross-exing the 2AC to a politics DA, you want to figure out what their best answer is. What's the 2AR going to be? Like the 2AC to a politics DA is going to have some obvious losers, some like args that aren't winners or that you feel pretty confident on. Don't cross-ex those. Cross-ex the hard arguments. Cross-ex the arguments that you are afraid of, that are good, because that's where you need the most work. That's what you should prioritize. You want to focus on what's going to be around at the end of the debate. Like think about this. I know I've got high school LDers, high school policy folks, and college folks all in the same Zoom room right now. Plus, who knows who watching the live stream. So everybody has a different final speech. But in like a college policy debate, your final rebuttal is 6 minutes. You had so much speaking time before that. But at the end of the day, everything's got to fit into that final rebuttal. And so many things are going to fall away. If you cross-ex something that's not in the final rebuttal, that might be a sign that you didn't use your time as effectively as possible. It's not always the case, because if you push your opponents off an arg they wanted to go for, that's still definitely a win. But you want to think about, what do you want at the end of the debate, and what does your opponent want at the end of the debate? Because if you are cross-exing those things, then you are making your cross-ex matter. Because if you cross-ex an argument that's so bad, there's no way your opponent could go for it. If you cross-ex an argument that you could beat in milliseconds on the line by line of your 1AR, or your partner's 1AR in this case, like why? Why waste valuable cross-ex time winning something you are always going to win anyway? Cross-ex should be a game changer. It should tackle the hard issues so you can, in places where you're behind, mount a comeback, or in places where you can offer an explanation to the judge that will cut through your opponent's arguments like butter and situate you substantially farther ahead in the debate, then do that. Avoid easy wins because they don't get you as much as cross-sexing the hard stuff. I'm going to do a little bit of speech by speech. So let's talk about the 1AC. I'm going to be a little policy focused right now. The cross-sex of the 1AC should be the only time you cross-sex the case debate. Obviously, you're going to cross-sex the case, but the really important thing here is don't do it again. In every other speech, you're going to have an opportunity to cross-sex something that you only get one shot at. You only get one shot at cross-sexing the 2AC to any given position. If the 2N goes for T or a counterplan, debates that can sometimes be complex and have a lot of moving parts, you only get one shot to cross-sex the development of those moving parts. So going back to cross-sex earlier stuff in the debate, or using the cross-sex of the 2AC to talk about the solvency of the affirmative, you already had a 3-minute chance to do that. So don't re-cross-sex the case. The one possible exception is a one-off K debate, where the case debate can sometimes be as or even more important than the K. Possible exception. What you should be doing in the cross-sex of the 1AC, I think focusing on solvency and internal links. Impacts can be easy. They can be a fallback strategy. I'm sure that most advanced debaters could cross-sex econ decline equals war in their sleep. But you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck thinking about solvency and internal links. Because I know that to outsiders, impacts seem ridiculous, right? Like the often localized debate perspective or layperson debate perspective is like, why do you all talk about nuclear war so much? Impacts can seem ridiculous, but honestly, when we comparatively think about like what's more ridiculous, an internal link or an impact, the impact is like the world would be bad if the economy collapsed. Okay, the world would be pretty bad if we allowed climate change to go unmitigated. So again, yes, that one I feel pretty good about. Russia going to war with the United States, bad thing. Also, check, yes. Now let's talk about internal links. We adopt narrow policy changes that are maybe 15 words, often these like ridiculously vague statements that the affirmative claims to mean definitively means one thing. And we're like, okay, if we do that, boom, the economy is golden. And okay, so the affirmative read some cards that, the plan boosts the economy, but it's like, we'll never have to worry about it again. Like this one law and the economy is like fine for all time. There will never be another threat to the economy ever again. Or your very particular solution to climate change that isn't even oriented around the environment initially is going to solve emissions sufficiently in every part of the globe and in every sector of the economy sufficiently to prevent the positive feedback loops that you say we're like minutes away from seeing permafrost melt and doom the earth. Color me skeptical. I am a lot more apt to think about the sillier parts of the affirmative and disads are in the idea that these either tiny technical changes or the status quo is going to fix these big problems. I think that's where your focus should be. Cross-sex of the 1NC should focus on the off-case positions that you think are most likely to be the 2NR. And I love a laser focus. I love when people bet big. And so what I mean by that is, let's say you're debating a team that loves to read just a bunch of arguments. And maybe to you that's 4, maybe to some other people it's 9. So let's call it an off-case. Let's say it's a 1NC where there's 7 off-case arguments. One approach to this would be to say, I'm going to ask one question on each of them. That way, no matter what the 2NR goes for, I've covered my bases and I've tried to punch at least one hole in it. But here's the thing, I don't think your opponents are equally likely to go for each of those positions. I bet some of them are bad and some of them are less bad. And I bet your opponent has empirical and ideological proclivities to go for some arguments over others. So for example, you're looking at the wiki and you're debating some school that's gone for politics in 17 of 19 2NRs. You should spend all 3 minutes on the politics DA. Let's say your opponents, every 1NC is diverse, but every 2NR is the K. I call these teams faux flex teams. You should spend all 3 minutes on the critique. Let's say that the 1NC is pretty bland, but they have one hyper-specific argument to your case that you've never seen before and is like very well developed. So it's like multiple cards specific to your affirmative. Like maybe this team's your rival and it's like quite clear that this strategy was written to beat you. All 3 minutes on that argument. What I'm saying here is that there are either in-round clues or intel and scouting that can tell you what your opponent is more likely to go for. And rather than spreading your questions around, I think you should make a bet. I think you should take a risk and say, I think they want to go for this. I am going to spend all 3 minutes tearing it apart. And either I'm right and I deter their best argument from being in the 2NR, win. I'm right and they still go for it, but I've substantially weakened the position, win. Or I was wrong and I picked the wrong position. But as you get better at picking up on these clues, which are very not that hard to pick up on, you will be right far more often than you are wrong. Cross-X of the 2AC. I like this one, so I have already sort of hinted at what I'm going to say here many times. Easy rule of thumb, the cross-X of the 2AC should add 3 minutes to the 1NR. The 1NR is one of the most amazing speeches in debate. You get nearly infinite prep time. You get to drop the hammer on the affirmative with them having a lopsided amount of less prep time compared to the 2NC. It's protected from cross-X. The 1NR is amazing. To effectively use it even better, add 3 minutes to it by cross-examining the answers to the position that you're going to take in the 1NR. If you're going to go for a process counterplan with an internal net benefit in the 1NR, use all 3 minutes of the cross-X of the 2AC to dismantle with, again, a laser-like focus, the in order, but an order of priority. Cross-X of the 2NC. You should be, sorry, I just saw a tech change and I wasn't sure if anything was going on, but if Jackie doesn't say anything, I'll assume we're good. The cross-X of the 2NC should dismantle what you think is most likely to be in the 2NR. And so this can go a couple of different ways. If the 2N takes T, a counterplan in case, then you want to think what's more likely to be the 2NR, T or the counterplan, because we're never going to re-cross-X the case. That's the job of the cross-X of the 1AC. The focus should be on what you think they can win on. And so maybe split your time between T and the counterplan. Really sort of depends on what's in the speech, but your goal should be to feel out what does this 2N want to go for? The best 2Ns are going to put their best offense in the 1NR, and that's going to be difficult because they're going to obstruct you. I like to go for just only case in the 2NC, which forced a defensive cross-X by my opponent. You can still do the best you can, but good 2NCs can still have a lot of diverse pressure and create openings for you to tear apart the answers to the thing that 2N cares about the most. And also kind of luckily, a lot of 2Ns are overwhelmingly narcissistic and put the thing they want to take in the 2NC. That is great for you, because that means you get 3 minutes to take shots at the thing that they want to go for the most. So take advantage and dismantle that argument. It creates huge opportunities for you to turn things around. And you should have some willingness to make arguments that are either on the borderline of being new or honestly even kind of past it. Because the argument that a 1AR argument should be rejected for being new loses a lot of ethos when you have cross-examined that argument in the cross-X of the 2NC. I'm not saying it's just like automatically you can't say those args are new and should be deleted off the flow, but it is much harder to have the moral high ground if you got eviscerated on it in cross-X, because it makes it look like a procedural complaint or whine instead of you being right on the substance. All right, we are on our last big tip. Cross-X is a crystal ball to predict your opponent's plans. Cross-X is a crystal ball to predict what your opponent wants to do. Let's assume your opponent is good at cross-X. That means they're being argumentative. They're focused on the parts of the debate that are most important. And those two things together are your opponent showing you their cards, showing you their hands, saying, this is what I want to focus on at the end of the debate. If they're doing cross-X right, if they're doing everything I've just said, they are highlighting the issues they want to win the debate on. Now, that's not a reason to not do those things. You should still do those things. It definitely is the best return on investment strategy for you to win in cross-ex. But you should also be aware that when your opponents are doing this, you can learn from it. You can see the arguments that they want to go for, and you should get ready for that right away. For example, if you take an L in cross-ex, you get embarrassed on some question. It's fine, it happens. It's not the end of the world. You get the opportunity to fix it later. But you're not going to unless you immediately start to think about how to fix it. And this was not something I realized while I was debating. It was something I realized while I was coaching. That if you take an L in cross-ex, you have to fix it immediately. I always will use the word procrastinated. I was like, there are other tasks I've got to focus on. This is probably going to come up again, but I'll deal with it when I'm prepping my 1AR, right? Because that's where I'm going to have to actually make this argument next. But that doesn't work, because if you got hosed on an argument in cross-ex and you're just like, I'll have to come back to this later, when they make that argument, I'll stick with my speech examples, in the block, and you're trying to prep it in the 1AR, you're just in the same situation where you're on the spot again, and you haven't worked out how you're going to deal with this problem. So cross-ex can be useful for predicting what your opponents are going to do in a lot of ways. And you should listen to what their arguments are, because they're showing you their hand. And you should use that to inform where you're spending prep time and where you're spending mental energy. And if you take a big L in cross-ex, it's not game over. I promise you, you can come back from it later, but you don't fix a perceptual loss by going through the motions. You fix the fact that you're perceived to be losing on an issue with a bombastic good response. And I don't mean use the phrase, I know I sounded like I was losing on this before, because when you say that, you sound like you're losing. But if you can up your rhetorical game and make a high quality argument at the moment you're addressing something that you were losing before, you can change the tide. You can change the perception of who's ahead. And you can literally make the judge think, oh, they came up with an answer and it's good. And that checks the box you need to check. Okay. We are now moving on to the third part of the lecture. 9 focused tips, 9 smaller tips. Those were all pretty big. I talked for a while on each point. These are going to be a little bit quicker. First, don't do the Control F test. What I mean by that is questions like, where does your evidence say this? Can you read a line from your evidence that says that? These are bad questions. They're not particularly argumentative, and they are a sink for your time. And there's almost no possible scenario where they put you ahead, because here are the possible outcomes. Your opponent points to the line, you take an L. Your opponent lies and says a line is there and it's not. And now you're in a they said, and there's no winner, especially the judge, who is definitely losing at life when they have to listen to this. They bend the truth, or worst of all, they make an argument that's better than the card. Because when you ask, can you read a line from your evidence that says this thing? And your opponent ignores that and responds by making just a brilliant argument, or even just a smart argument, you are left with the ethos of, but what about the card, judge? And here's the thing, we just don't care. We like smart arguments. Don't get me wrong, evidence is good and qualified evidence is even better. But I will take a smart analytical argument over a reliance on evidence every day. And that sentiment is the closest thing to uniform among every type of judge in the debate community, whether it's a parent judge, a K judge, policy judge, a blank slate judge. Smart analytic over reliance on evidence is pretty much the only thing that we could probably all agree on. And so when you're trapped in saying, but your ev doesn't say that, you're taking a hard L. Second, communicate with your partner and integrate their arguments. Nothing is worse than a devastating cross-ex of a 1AC followed by a 1NC that makes none of those arguments. During the cross-ex of the 1AC, the 1N should be listening. I like to call this one ear open, where you are working at assembling the 1NC, or I don't know, even prepping the 1NR overview for a DA you're likely to take, but you have one ear open so that when your partner gets a win in cross-ex, You can integrate that into your 1NC. Now, ideally, I mean writing it on your flow and not into a speech document, because I like arguments to live on the flow. But again, flowing lecture, different question. Integrate your opponent's arguments into speeches. Second part of this, in addition to integrating their arguments, you should listen, because cross-ex is often an opportunity for you to be prepping. Now, I'm going to use the cross-ex of the 2NC as an example of this. The cross-ex of the 2NC is a love letter to the 1A. It's a fireside chat between the 2A and the 1A. We've all heard the boat metaphor, right? The 2A is the captain of the aft ship, the 2N is the captain of the neg ship. So because they get to zoom in, especially the 2A in the middle of the debate, there's so much time between the 2AC and the 2AR that when they do the cross-ex of the 2NC, they don't have to be hyper-focused. They can think about how arguments interact, where the most important issues are, and they can use cross-ex to put a spotlight on those issues. And that spotlight is to the judge, but it is also to the 1AR. It is a bat signal for the 1AR to know what the most important argument in the debate is, because the cross-ex of the 2AC should be about the most critical arguments. If you're debating a counterplan and your strategy is to go for permutation to the counterplan or a intrinsic perm, these like complex theoretical debates that can be pretty hard to piece together effectively, the 2A gets to coach the 1A on the args they want the 1A to make during this cross-ex, because they are literally making those arguments already to the judge. So as the 1A, one ear open, listening to these things, so that when your partner gets back from this cross-ex, they don't have to be like, okay, here's the way we're going to win this argument, because you've already heard them explain it. 3, don't interrupt your partner. For the younger debaters here, you might be asking or getting asked the question, is tag team allowed? Virtually, yes. Like, there are certainly some judges who are going to say no in like local circuits of lay judges, but like, yes, it's allowed. That does not mean it is a good idea. Just because you can interrupt your partner doesn't mean you should interrupt your partner, because those interruptions, whether during cross-ex or any other speech, destroy your partner's rhythm, and they signal a lack of confidence in your partner that undermines your credibility. Remember, I don't believe in rep, I believe in credibility. And one good way to destroy yours is to signal to the judge that you don't have the confidence in your partner for them to handle a basic cross-ex question. Nobody wants to vote for the team that has a rude debater that thinks their partner can't handle their own speeches. And this is especially true when it's a cis dude speaking over anyone who's not a cis dude. But there is a strategic reason, in addition to an ethos reason, to avoid interrupting your partner, which is you have something else you're supposed to be doing. There's always a task that you have. And if you're in the cross-ex, your task is your cross-ex. Remember I talked about sort of order of speeches, and I was like, if your next speech is a cross-ex, then like that is your next speech. Well, the corollary is also true. If that cross-ex is not your speech, then you're the one who's giving the next constructive or rebuttal, and you need to be focused on that. That's your job. That's the thing that you're supposed to be doing. So real quick, this interruption thing can be really important. So I'm going to do my rules for interruption, unless Jackie intervenes to tell me that I have a hard time limit of an hour, in which case I will quickly wrap up. But otherwise, I've probably got.
You're good to go.
Nice. 15 more minutes of content, max. So we're still on don't interrupt, but we're zooming out for a second, and we're not going to talk about cross-ex specifically. I'm going to get into the rules for interrupting your partner. And largely, this is going to be centered around a theory I call the hot seat effect, which is that if you're not in the hot seat, if you're not in the cross-ex, the constructive, or the rebuttal, you might think that you can give a marginally better answer to a question or an argument because you don't have the pressure on you. Here's the thing, the hot seat effect is troublesome because it's true. When the pressure's not on you and you don't have to think about how to answer everything that's happening, you can give a marginally better answer, but the key word is marginally. And the costs to marginally improving an answer, disrupting your partner's rhythm, destroying your credibility and ethos, vastly outweigh the benefits. So we have rules, 3 of them. 1, do not interrupt your partner unless you are going to lose because of something that is either said or not said. If the 2N or the 1R is about to drop conditionality. By all means, feel free to interrupt. You're going to lose the debate if you drop conditionality. If you're interrupting because you think that you can tweak the answer your partner gave to make it a little bit better, please remain seated and focus on the thing that you are supposed to be doing, because the benefits are not worth it. Rule number 2, plan your intervention. If it is worth intervening, it is worth writing down virtually every word of what you're going to say. I like this for a couple of reasons. One is that if you're not willing to write down what you're going to say, we have not reached the threshold for what a worthwhile intervention is. And 2, it creates an efficient intervention, because interrupting your partner can be like a terrible moment. If you're like, hey, you dropped X, please answer it. A couple of things are going to happen. One is your partner's going to be like, I did answer that. Shush, because you weren't flowing. 2 is your partner's going to be like, oh no, what do I say? Because if you intervene to tell someone to answer something, like, I don't know, like ponder for a moment why they didn't. Maybe they don't have an answer to that. Maybe they didn't flow it, which is like, not great, flowing lecture. But on the spot, are they supposed to come up with the answer? You can't intervene to tell someone to answer something. You need to intervene to tell them how to answer something. And that should be planned. It should be efficient. It should be at a natural point where your partner is moving between things. You're not interrupting them in the middle of a sentence. Last, third rule of interventions, not in the bottom 30 seconds of a speech. There is no intervention, virtually, asterisk condo, that is worth happening in the bottom 30 seconds of a speech, because you're definitely going to trade off with something your partner thinks is important during the most high pressure time of their speech, and you're going to end on a sour note that leaves a bad taste in the judge's mouth, and at a subconscious level is going to program the judge to think that you are the worst team. And it is those little subconscious factors in a close debate can add up and be really important. 4th of 9 focus tips. Verbal slip-ups are not verbal slip-ups, ironic, are not concessions. At least once a tournament, I will see a debate where 2 folks in cross-X aren't understanding each other. Usually it's because one person is just too intent on saying the thing they want to say, and they're not really listening to their opponent, so they misinterpret the response. But it could just be because you're kind of talking past each other. You don't understand the concepts that are being utilized by your opponent, and so it just doesn't quite click. And as a result of this, you might be hearing what you want to hear and think that there's a concession. But if I, as the judge, kind of see what's happening and see how the miscommunication is happening, then I might not think you're getting the concession that you think you are. Cross-X is binding. Okay? Traps are good and important. But if you're not listening carefully to what your opponent is saying, you might not be getting the W you think you are. So like concessions from Cross-X, great, but you have to actually be understanding what your opponent is saying. 5th, don't cross-X after the timer goes off. Speech times are non-negotiable. This would be entirely non-controversial if I was like, you don't get to add a minute to your constructive. I was like, you can't make the 2AC 8 minutes if you're a college debater, or 9 minutes if you're a high school debater, and you can't make the 1AR 5 minutes if you're a high school LD debater. Speech times are non-negotiable, and title of the lecture, cross-X is a speech. There are a lot of judges that is just absolutely not going to fly in front of, and I encourage you to stay very far away from doing that. But if someone does it to you, you need to have a plan for what your response is going to be. If the timer goes off and somebody's like, no, I'm going to use prep time to ask questions. Again, ridiculous. You don't get to use prep time to extend a 2AR or a 2AC. You shouldn't get to use prep time to extend the cross-X of the 2AC. If you're arguing, you're using speech time, and there are limits to speech time. However, if someone is doing this to you, it may not be the right choice to make that procedural objection. Like maybe it is. Like I suppose if you have me in the back of the room, be confident that if you say cross-X is over, I not only agree with you, my pen will not move. I flow cross-X. But when the speech time stops, I will do my best to not listen to the arguments that are being made. If you can ask information-seeking questions, like if this is maybe a more appropriate time if you have to ask where a card wasn't read. You don't want to burn cross-ex time on it, but it's fine to use prep time for that. I won't actively try and drown those things out. But if you are trying to argue, I'll drown those out. But I'm not always going to be your judge. I'm probably never going to be most of your judges. So you need to know if that strategy is not going to work, what you should do. If you think your judge is going to find a strategy of just being like cross-ex is over to be a procedural complaint, or even cowardly, like you're avoiding the issues, then it might not be your best strategy to stick to a rules-based defense. And you should maybe continue to engage in the cross-ex. This requires knowing your judge. The second calculation you can make here is, are you winning? What if your opponent wants to take prep time to ask you questions, but you've just been crushing this cross-ex, and you're like, you feel great, you're on fire, you're having like the greatest speech of your life. Like, I don't know, like maybe just keep going. Like if you're winning, why not? These are calculations that you should make. But what you should do is make a firm decision. So it looks like you've not forfeited the ethos advantage. Stick to your choice, be firm in it, whatever it is. I'm going to shrink down to two more things. Second to last, don't draw attention to dropped arguments. Now, I've sort of covered this already because I said avoid easy wins, but I'm going to be a lot more careful here. If an argument is dropped, you can't lose it. There's zero potential gain from a cross-ex question about a dropped argument, but there is total potential for loss because you open the door for new answers. Like, what is the point of asking about something if you're not giving your opponent an opportunity to respond to it? Like, your question is like, this argument was dropped. Is your expectation that your opponent is just going to be like, yeah, oof? Because that's probably not going to happen. They are probably going to say, here's why I think that's bad. And what are you left with? One of two things. You can say, you can't say that, it's new. But again, what was your expectation here? You're the one that asked about it. You opened the door. The moral high ground is gone. Or you can start to argue about it, which again, you've gone from 100% winning to ever shrinking as they come up with better arguments. I want to tell a little story here to drive home the point. One example of this is counterplan text flaws. It is a very bad idea to cross-ex a counterplan text being written incorrectly because the 2N can fix it. And yes, you can have a debate about whether or not 2NC counterplans are legitimate or illegitimate. They're legitimate, probably, especially like tiny ones that fix little issues like these that you might be pointing out. So when you cross-ex about this, you could take 100% win on an entire off-case position because they wrote their counterplan text wrong and turn it into a bagel, a zero, because the 2N just fixes it at the top of the 2NC. And in fact, a smart 1N can say, if it's true that the counterplan text was written incorrectly, then it will be changed. It will be changed to incorporate exactly what you're talking about, and it will be the first words out of the 2N's mouth during the 2NC. If you have any questions about it, you can ask about it now, which means it's functionally being introduced right now because you can use this cross-ex to ask about the new text. That's very hard to respond to, I promise you. And here's the story. Years and years ago, I was coaching at Liberty University, where I coached a team of Lincoln Garrett and Austin Woodruff. I'd been working with them for a couple of years, and so they kind of knew this stuff, right? I'd given probably a very similar version of this lecture, and so they knew don't cross-ex about counterplan text flaws. And so the counterplan in this debate against a very good team from Wake Forest University has the wrong country in it. It's a foreign policy topic. Liberty reads an AF about Syria. Wake had just debated a team that reads an AF about Egypt. Literal wrong country. Kind of hard for a counterplan to solve when it is about a literal different country. So cross-ex the 1NC, not brought up. Smooth, great, excellent. Cross-ex, or the 2AC says Syria is key on the line by line in the 2AC on the counterplan. Looks like nothing, so it's not going to draw attention, but the 1A could easily stand up and say, go to 2AC number 2, Syria is key. They wrote their counterplan text wrong, and you could obviate basically the entire 2NC. 2NC, gone, zapped, done. You only have to debate the 1 and R. That's like huge. That would be big. That would have been a major upset because that Wake team was ranked very highly. However, in the 2NC cross-X, 2NC is over. And so the Liberty debaters, I get where they're coming from. They think there's no more opportunities to fix this. The window has closed because there are no more constructives left. So why not cross-X about this dropped argument now? It's easy, and I'll get a good win on it. Don't cross-X easy things. Because when this cross-X happens, the 2N immediately responds, we are going to change the counterplan text at the top of the 1NR. It will be the very first words that the top of the 1NR says, and you can ask any questions you want to now. You're going to say that 1NR counterplans are illegitimate, but the only warrant you will have for that is that you can't cross-X a 1NR. But there are 2 minutes and 46 seconds left of this cross-X, and you may use as many of those seconds as you want to ask me questions about the new counterplan text. Poof, entire argument gone. Last, reject the premise of the question. A lot of this lecture is about how to ask questions. Some of it was about how to answer them. My biggest tip for how to answer them is reject the premise of the question. Your opponents are going to start many questions with something that they assert or presume or imply to be true. And if you deal with the tail end of the question only, you are debating on their terms. Think about the first half of the question. Reject the premise of the question. All right, that's all I've got.
That was awesome, Matt. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone who tuned in live and anyone who watches this later. I hope you learned a lot. What I wanted to give opportunity now in case is there anyone who's here in the Zoom or on the live channel who has a quick question? Wait, like 5 seconds to see if we have any takers. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Matt, for talking about cross-examination. I will be hitting you up for the flowing lecture. So come to our next CEDA series lecture coming soon. We've got a ton of things on the list that I hope will be helpful and informative, including an upcoming flowing lecture. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Jackie. Bye.